apparently obscuring all of our other data types, and thus we have to rely on old data for any projections beyond 2013. So we don't know if there's any validity to those. We have no way of validating anything from our old data set beyond the flush or the breaking wave of the immediacy data that we're in at the moment. And basically what I'm saying is that the emotions are running so high that at any moment mob rule might take over and all projections are out the window. And that's kind of how our data sets react to the level of intensity and duration values. As intensity rises, duration values decrease. So we do have a fairly rich data set that projected all the way out to 2041 and beyond, and there was effectively no dollar issues arising from 2014 onward. And in fact, at that point, it appeared that the calorie what we were calling the calorie economy was actually in place. And basically, at 2014 onward, our data had suggested, and we had a number of perhaps 10-year history of collecting the data, that a situation would arise where spare calories of food would be the lowest common denominator backing anything, including gold and silver. And so the next level up would be the precious metals as a storehouse of the ability to buy spare calories of food from farmers and so on. And from there on, other tradable goods, and we would gradually work our way out of what has been a horrible agenda on the part of the powers that be these last, 12,000 years.
Well, there certainly is, yeah.
Sorry, Turd, just to elaborate with that question from Turd about the timeline. In the Shape 5 report, you actually, you gave some monkey mind timelines on what you expect might happen. Could you probably elaborate on that? Because I know in previous interviews, Clif, you said you expected first $5 and $20 days in silver, then the COMEX to collapse. You also expected Europe to collapse before the US collapsed, and then the just-in-time system to collapse. As Turd's previous question, could you maybe paint a monkey mind step-by-step picture of what you can see? Maybe if you don't have the timeline, the actual temporal markers before all hell breaks loose?
Sure, yeah. Some of the temporal markers are easily delineated. I don't have an actual timeline because the way in which the data is presented to us, we get little clusters usually because you cannot advance the model space moment by moment, second by second in any meaningful manner. So what we sort of have to do is to blink ahead at a fairly fast rate and look for these clusters of interesting data. Those form our temporal markers. And they might appear as growing and dissolving and like crystals on some kind of speeded up high-definition film. And when we get those, we know we're sort of in the right track of the shifting intensity values and so on. So what I'm looking for is a series of events that will, at the most immediate level, will be are being brokered or are being offered to us by way of the sudden blue bankruptcy. Now, I'm suspecting at this point, because of the huge number of people in blue wool suits that we're actually talking about the post office, when that starts going down, that's going to open up the floodgates for a whole series of fiscal and financial problems. Now, these are not economic in that sense. So what I'm talking about are banks and the ability to move money, and I don't want to say like a Hertzstadt lockup, but probably something not equivalent to that, but replacing that as the next generation's huge worry. And let me state something really clearly about this. The data and any rational analysis will present to you the idea that what we're currently living through is a once in history, once in a civilization level event. Because what we are contemplating is the erosion, and we're living through it now, and sometimes 2 and 3% per day, especially based on gold, maybe 10% per day, erosion of the purchasing power of a global reserve currency that will touch every human on the planet. Never in this current civilization, in the last 13,000 years, has anything close to this ever arisen. The most, the closest we can come in an approximation would be the minor event of the collapse of France and the bringing in of the Bonaparte reign and the many republics there after the John Law incidents, or the shift into the warring clan states of China following the collapse of the first Qin Empire, when their currency was seriously debased, and they'd even done a paper currency effort. It lasted some 24 years, I think. Anyway, under both of those conditions, the globe was changed. In one case, we ended up with, in China, with vast levels of diaspora as populations were shifted by the warring factions, and this in turn led to generations of nomadism and brought in the Mongolian people and all different kinds of ramifications there. So we're at that level of discussion. The discussion of whether or not stockbrokers might be plunging to their death a year from now from tall buildings is neither here nor there, because we're looking at the collapse of the former British Empire and the bust-up of what people used to call Great Britain into some new entity based on the people that will endure what they're going to go through. And that same level of disruption is planet-wide. There's riots in Berlin and Madrid. They're camping out to protest the austerity and getting beaten by the police, and it just goes on and on and on. This level of planetary unquiet is the social chaos that we've been forecasting for a number of years. We're into it right now. If we look at the timeline, we'll be looking at a situation where a sudden bankruptcy opens up and exposes, if you will, the bleeding wound of the currency system, which in turn will be followed by a number of events, all of which will shake confidence and bring us to our $5 and our $20 days, and then we get a collapse. Now, before then, I expect to see the indications that the riot, an actual physical presence, disruption, a scene, if you will, of uber rich will occur because they won't be able to claim their items that were theoretically stored for safekeeping, i.e. gold, I believe. And that'll be one of our next temporal markers. One of the further temporal markers we're about to get will be a shift by some of the southern economies to an entirely different structure of what I want to say, intercountry trading. And I don't know that we're even talking about a currency level kind of a thing, or if it's an amalgamation of energy companies across national borders against the wishes of the U.S., but it's going to cause some real issues relative to the aquifers that the Bushies think they own in South America. Just as we saw in India recently, the repudiation of the aristocracy's claim to divine right to rule by the judges awarding the possession of this incredible billion-dollar fortune in gold and jewels to the Indian people, which who knows if it'll be stolen by politicians or not. That isn't the point. The point is that it had been assumed it was owned by the royal family. And now we're going to see some of the assumptions that the elite have operated on tested over these next few days, the rest of this month, basically, up till about the 31st or so. And some of those tests are key temporal markers for the collision of interest that's going to be what follows the dollar dying. So it's dying at the moment. Will it last through the October crises? Probably, and it'll probably last here in the U.S. a year longer than it exists as a reserve currency. But it's still not going to be anything anybody really wants to have.
Thanks. Go ahead, Ted.
Well, I guess my last question dealt with something that I have not really been able to get my hands around this week, and so I can't say that I know much about it. I'm trying to bring myself up to speed. But it goes right into what you're saying about the post office, and because that situation seems so unusual to me that the Postal Service would need to declare bankruptcy, and that there are so many different ways that they can raise revenue. But this issue that came up this week had to do with Tropos Capital Corporation. Have you heard of this, Clif?
It's a hit the spiders. The intensity value just shot through the roof for whatever reason. And
it has to do with the Bank of International Settlements. And as you talked about the United States Postal Service being, you said, the number 2
The shifter of wire transfer. They used to be number one on the planet, and they were overtaken by the International Monetary Fund, which ships through the BIS. Correct.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, I don't have enough about I don't know enough about this yet to be able to talk about it in a sophisticated manner.
The rumors. Excuse me. The rumors that are going around may or may not be true, but the linkage within our data to BIS and let's say their associates. I don't want to use company names or anything like that in anything that would be released on YouTube, because then it might be come back to haunt me via somebody getting irritated that I'm offering financial advice. But let's just say that the BIS, which is a more or less closed institution, will be opened up a bit and connected by the 25th or 26th of October with the Vatican in something that nobody wants to smell anywhere. And what you're seeing now is likely, I think some of the intensity values arising from the associates of BIS are reflecting that ahead of the actual stink.
Interesting. Well, yes, and there's a lot of smoke there, and like I said, I'm trying so hard to piece it all together myself to see what it all means. But one last question, Cliff, and then I'll be quiet for a while. And this is off the subject, but this comes from my daughter, if that's okay.
Sure.
She is a rather rambunctious, soon-to-be 8th grader, and the thing that keeps her up at night are the prospect of solar storms and the disruption that could provide. We've seen such a major uptick in solar activity in the last even weeks. Anything in your work that you see that we should be concerned about in the days to come?
Yes, there's vast quantities of it. It's not a reassuring subject. Where do you? No, I don't want to invite that. Let me put it to you this way. There's a historical precedence for people taking refuge in large caves during solar periods, and we see a concurrent movement in the federal government in the last year that's been accelerating to deny access to people in general to wilderness areas in which caves that could house many hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions, are existent. The two are not a coincidence. So if one were to live in an area in which there might be a cave that, say, you could quickly drive your pickup and your family into and get out of solar radiation, then one might be advised to check that out in advance. Failing that, there are other ways to make sort of artificial caves. It's advisable to really look at the issue of the solar flaring, what NASA's doing, their alarm level in terms of the language they're using with their own people, and to make plans accordingly. And so we know, for instance, that, hang on a second. Chattamate kudasai! Misha, no. Anyway, so I cannot reassure you relative to the solar storms. We have some serious issues. Even a minor Carrington event that damages transformers on the poles out in front of our houses is going to be a serious mega event for us, because we don't make those things even on this continent anymore. And right. It'll be just incredible to try and trade our real treasure for those devices being made elsewhere, such that we can re-electrify our country. And if it comes to that, I have a whole lot of suggestions about how we should follow Buckminster Fuller's idea of how to electrify the planet and redistribute our electrical grid, because it makes a lot more sense than the way it's laid out now, and would be much more efficient. But beyond that, we're going to face some serious challenges with even a minor solar flaring. And as you point out, the sun is very unquiet and shows every sign of continuing that trend and even accelerating it. So at a personal level, I have the ability to crank out 15 kW off of one generator. I have a backup generator available to me for that generator should it fail. I've got solar power, because solar panels are basically immune, the panels themselves, from any solar flaring, except